So I grew up in Dubuque, Iowa, right on the Mississippi River. I was a city kid. I have no background in agriculture. I was a political science and major in college. I went to a little small Catholic liberal arts college in Dubuque called Loras College, Loras, Loras College. And I went off to Madison, Wisconsin one day in 1964 and took the Foreign Service exam, possibly become an American diplomat. I was inspired by President Kennedy, who had said if he hadn't gone in politics, he would have liked to have been in the Foreign Service. So I thought, wow, well, but what's the chance of a kid from Dubuque passing that test? That's for people who go to Harvard and Princeton and Yale and Georgetown. And, but I took the test, and lo and behold, I passed it. So then you have to take an oral exam. And so by 1966, I took the oral exam and I passed that. And by that time I was living in College Park, Maryland, going to the University of Maryland, working towards a PhD. But all of a sudden I'm about to become a diplomat. So I go down to Washington, DC, with, College Park is just right inside the Beltway, and raised my hand and was sworn in August of 1967 as a brand new 26-year-old Foreign Service officer. And I was asked, what do you want to do? And I said, well, I want to go to Paris. I want to go to London. I want to go to Vienna. And I want to go to all those diplomatic soirees and chandeliered ballrooms and sip aperitifs and talk about the intricacies and nuances of diplomatic affairs, which is what I thought all diplomats did. And because I was 26, that meant I was still draft eligible, and I was single and male, and I'd never been in the military. The State Department said, there's a war in Vietnam, and you're going to be sent there. And so I was trained for a year in Vietnamese language in Washington, D.C., and I lived through the most tumultuous year in America after the Civil War in 1968. Washington was burning, Martin Luther King was assassinated, Robert Kennedy was assassinated. There was the Tet Offensive in Vietnam. So the country was in turmoil. But at the end of the year, I got on a plane and I flew off to Saigon and arrived there. But on my way out, I began my encounter with China because I was going to be a rural development advisor. I was going to work advising out in villages in the Mekong Delta. And so to prepare for that, we had a week of training in Taiwan. So the first time I came in contact with Chinese culture, Chinese society, was in Taiwan. And spending a week there in Taipei, Taichung. And so this was, I'd never been outside America. I'd never been on an airplane till I was 23 years old. So this was all brand new. And then after Taiwan, I flew to Hong Kong and had a long weekend before we flew to Vietnam. And Hong Kong was still post-colonial, it was still, of course, a colonial possession of Great Britain, but it was this post-colonial era in Asia. And there were no tall buildings in Hong Kong. Hong Kong was as it was in the 1940s and 50s. You could sit and watch the junk type Chinese ships around through the harbor. It was just incredible. So fascinating, the language, the script, I couldn't understand things. It was mysterious, but exciting and filled with energy. Mainland China, of course, was just totally cut off. It was a mystery. It was 1960, mid-60s, still in the throes of the Cultural Revolution. Mao Zedong, his wife, the Gang of Four. So could we ever know anything about it? It was forbidden. And Americans studied it from outside, from Taiwan, from Hong Kong. Anyway, I spend 6 years working in Vietnam. I'm out in villages. I learn a lot of lessons about the transformative power of agriculture and rural roads, about new seeds and how they could change life dramatically. And I would, in the midst of all that, I received my orders. I had to do 18 months in Vietnam, and I received my orders. And they said, we know what you want to do, so we're going to send you to Harvard to study European labor movements. And then we're going to assign you in Western Europe. We're not sure where, but you're going to be at an embassy in Western Europe, exactly what you wanted. So you can imagine how happy and pleased I was about that, until a journalist showed up, and I was taking him out and around to some of the villages where I was working, and he asked me, what are you going to do? And I said, oh, I'm going to Harvard, and I'm going to study European labor movements, and I'm going to be stationed in Europe and Western Europe, and I'm going to be living and acting and having a career as a diplomat the way I dreamed. And he said, well, why would you want to do that? Here you're in the middle of this epic event of your generation. You speak the language, you step through the cultural veil, you're making a difference. Why would you want to do that? So I guess sometimes maybe people have like this one moment in time that changes your life forever. And I sat there talking with him, and I thought about it, and I finally looked back at him and I said, you know, I don't know why I'd want to do that. And I went back to my place where I lived that night, and I wrote to the State Department and said, I don't want to go to Harvard. I don't want to study European labor relations. I don't want to work in Europe. I want to stay in Vietnam. So I think they thought I was probably crazy, a little unstable, but they needed people to work there. So I was kept on, and I continued to work out in the countryside, and actually learned what I could do and contribute. And part of my 6 years, I did the first ever report about this terrible genocidal radical organization in Cambodia called the Khmer Rouge, the Red Cambodians, led by this terrible man named Pol Pot. And they eventually would impose this draconian regime upon all of Cambodia, a country of 7 million people, and 2 million people would die as a result of that. So I did the first report by anybody in the world about them. It wasn't believed inside the US government, and so nothing was done to stop the Khmer Rouge by our country. But this was going on. It was so terrible. So in the middle of my career, I went from Vietnam back, and I worked at the White House. I was on Henry Kissinger's National Security Council staff. I was interpreter in Vietnamese for the President of the United States. Wow. I then went to work for Assistant Secretary of State named Richard Holbrooke, quite well known in diplomatic affairs. He was a young guy just starting off, and I worked with him for almost 2 years. And then I took an assignment where I was loaned to the governor of Iowa, a Republican governor named Robert Ray. Wonderful, wonderful man, honest, integrity, inspired leader. And I'm nonpartisan. I'm not involved in any politics. I worked at the Republican White House. Holbrooke was a Democrat in the Carter administration. I worked for him. Now I'm working for a Republican governor. I would be like that throughout my career. Mm-hmm. So I'm here. I'm in Des Moines, Iowa, and it's 1979, and America and China established diplomatic relations. So wow, what a incredible breakthrough! What a dramatic change. Paramount leader Deng Xiaoping, who was kind of put down the Cultural Revolution after Mao Zedong's death, comes to the United States, has this historic visit, and after that, then there are exchanges that take place at different groups of people between the United States and China. And in October of 1979, the first ever delegation of governors, American governors, is going to go to China. Mm-hmm. Small group, and there was a organization called which still exists, still operates, National Committee for U.S.-China Relations. Mm-hmm. There was a young woman, I was part of it, named Jan Barris, and she's still there, by the way. Still working there, 50-some years later. But and she reaches out and invites Governor Ray to go. So there's about 4 or 5 governors, and we have our own U.S. Air Force plane. Each governor can bring 1 staff member, so I get to go. Mm-hmm. So here we fly off and we land in China, and wow. What had been this mysterious, forbidden land. And suddenly I'm there and I'm going to see it. And I go with the governors to a meeting with Deng Xiaoping. Oh, so here it is, 1979. We get to have a meeting with Deng Xiaoping. I get to see him. I get to shake hands with him. And I get to have this brief conversation with him. And I said to him, through an interpreter, of course, that I was working in Cambodia on the Khmer Rouge. And suddenly here I'm, mid-30s, American diplomat. I'm not anybody senior or important. And Deng Xiaoping gives me this very, very candid and highly critical statements about the Khmer Rouge and the terrible mistakes they have made. Mm. So I was just so taken aback that a communist leader, one of the biggest communist countries in the world, who were, had been considered an adversary of the United States, would speak so frankly about that subject to me. Well, so I remember that. I included comments when I wrote my doctoral dissertation on Pol Pot a couple of years later. Mm-hmm. And I got to spend then time in China traveling around on my own. So the governors went off, they had sort of private meetings, and usually travel was very restricted, but I was there in China. I went out to the airport, and mm-hmm. I went to Shanghai. And of course, China of 1979, there were no new buildings, no modern building. Everyone was dressed in these Mao suits, mm-hmm. either black, blue, or olive drab. And but I showed up and stayed at a hotel there down on the Bund, down on the waterfront. Yes. And I saw a political demonstration. I saw people holding signs at kind of the city hall or municipal building. I couldn't tell what they were demonstrating about, but it was remarkable.
Mhm.
And I looked across the harbor, and here's this big empty area called Pudong
Mhm.
Island. And then I flew off. I went to Guilin, and I rode the boat down the Li River. I thought I'll never be in China again. This is so amazing. I'm going to see everything I can. And then I go to Guangzhou. And Guangzhou, Canton, as it had been called,
Mhm.
kind of the business area where, and some foreign business persons from Hong Kong were able to come there and do business. And so I'm staying at this hotel, and it's all, they're kind of old and rundown hotels. And I go downstairs to find some place to eat, and I'm stunned because there in this old hotel is this modern coffee shop with neon lights and these formica tables, and the waitresses and server, the young women, are in miniskirts.
Mhm.
So this was so totally different than anything else I saw anywhere else in China. This one little sign
Mhm.
of something different, of modernity.
Mhm.
And I was, puzzled by it, but whatever.
Mhm.
Looking back, I refer to it as, I think it was like the first explosion of the Chinese Big Bang of economic development and modernization.
Mhm.
Because this is, of course, Guangzhou is where the first modern policies, the first opening to free markets, and the first areas, including the Shenzhen Special Zone, were established all around Guangzhou.
Mhm.
So we go back home to Iowa, back to Des Moines. I go back to working with the governor, and 1980 comes, and 1980, it's going to be a group of Chinese governors who come and visit the United States. And the National Council for U.S.-China Relations, Jan Barris, who had been with us on the trip to China. So we got to know her. She really liked Governor Ray. So this group of governors comes, and they're going to go to, I guess, Washington. They're going to go to New York. They're going to go to Colorado, and then California, and they're going to stop in Iowa along the way. So October of 1980, we go out to the airport and the governor's land, and we meet them, and we're escorting them in. And the governor of Guangzhou is the lead governor on the trip. So we have them for a couple of days. We give them a tour. I'm taking this group of governors around Iowa. We want to show them, we've got all these modern expressways and interstate highways. Take them to Iowa State University. We show them agricultural research centers. Take them to John Deere. We take them to a seed company now called DuPont Pioneer.
Mhm.
And we fly them or drive them around to other parts of the state, show them manufacturing, and a farm. We take them to a farm, and so a full,
Mhm.
tour about here's what Iowa is like. And on our way driving back to Des Moines, we stop what we think is an interesting place, kind of a tourist stop for an early dinner.
Mhm.
And the place we stop is called the Amana Colonies. So the Amana Colonies were started and settled in the late 19th century by German immigrants, wanted to get away from Germany and who believed in communism. And they had created a full communist society. All the land, everything was owned by the commune. Everyone worked on all the land together. All the crops that were grown were owned by the commune, sold by the commune. The money that was received went to pay for the housing where everyone lived and their eating places. And it was absolute socialism, communism, but from the people themselves.
Mm-hmm.
In the 1930s, during the Depression, they made a decision to change the structure of how they produced food, and they divided the commune up into individual family farms,
Mm-hmm.
but kept everything else the same. All of the other common things about social relationships, political, culture stayed the same. Just your family, you work that land, you sold your crops, you get money. And so we're there, and people from Amana are giving a little briefing, being translated into Chinese for this delegation led by the governor of Guangzhou. So as he hears this story, the governor becomes so interested, and he starts asking more questions about this than at any other stop along the way.
Mm-hmm.
And he can't stop asking questions. Now, I had no idea why. I thought, well, they must be fascinated that there was once communism in America.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, it's an interesting story to take back home.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what in fact was going on was that at that time, that the Chinese Communist Party, Deng Xiaoping, and his closest advisors, having had this Shenzhen special zone and first steps
Mm-hmm.
about free market economics, were trying to decide, can we, the Communist Party, can we change how agriculture operates? Can we change how agriculture is structured
Mm-hmm.
without losing the socialism that's built into it?
Mm-hmm.
And that without having it go back to this extreme capitalism that they had revolted against. And the lesson of Amana that the governor took back with him was that, yes, you can.
Mm-hmm.
You can change and divide up the land into family farms and still maintain the culture and the structure. So that governor, who played a very close and important advisory role with Deng Xiaoping, was named Shi Zhongsun. Sure, I'm not pronouncing it correctly. Shi Zhongsun,
Mm-hmm.
the father
Yes.
of Xi Jinping. And he was the man who was the architect of the Chinese Communist Party, the Chinese country of China,
Mm-hmm.
totally revising its approach to economics, introducing market approach, introducing free markets, introducing more dynamic aspects of free trade, free markets, which is what over 40 years has transformed China in the most stunning, incredible way. So when I arrived in China in 1979, about 70 or perhaps even more % of Chinese people lived in poverty,
Mm-hmm.
about the same amount as in Africa. There was no modernization. There were very few cars or automobiles around. You could almost walk across streets without looking,
Mm-hmm.
without worrying about being hit. People were pedaling around on bicycles. there was nothing dynamic. There was nothing modern except for that coffee shop in one hotel in Guangzhou. And this was 1978 was the beginning of what the Chinese Communist Party describes as its opening to the world, and certainly its opening to the West. And it was the also opening with the United States and the beginning of trade. There was no trade. There was no agricultural trade. There was no trade of any kind between the United States and China at that time. So here we have this interesting visit. I took this group around. I mean, I didn't know that I hadn't studied China. I wasn't aware that the governor of Guangzhou at the time played such a central role in that. So I go after Iowa, I go and have my rest of my diplomatic career. I'm observing China, in negotiating about our reestablishing diplomatic relations with Vietnam and with Cambodia in the 1990s. I played a central role in that. And we had meetings in China because the Chinese were involved. We had meetings to do everything we could to suppress the Khmer Rouge, the terrible, violent, genocidal Khmer Rouge. And so I got to see China, and each time I went to China, I'd see that it was changed and becoming more economically developed. And so I retired in 1999 after 3.5 years being the American ambassador in Cambodia. And for 20 years, led the World Food Prize, the quote unquote Nobel Prize for Food and Agriculture, started by America and Iowa's greatest hero, America's greatest agricultural scientist, named Norman Borlaug, the father of the Green Revolution, the man whose miracle wheat saved India and Pakistan from massive famine, starvation, millions and millions might die, and who also was one of the very first Americans to ever go to China. Went there in 1974, right after President Nixon's trip. So suddenly here, 1999, I'm connected with Norman Borlaug. He's in his mid-80s, still going strong, you know, Iowa farm boy. And we traveled to China together, and I got to see Chinese agriculture and see how productive it had become, and how, as one Chinese journalist said to me, you know, Chinese agriculture looks a lot like Iowa, looks a lot like what I had shown to that governor, that group of governors when they came in 1980. So I'm off in my diplomatic career, but in 1985, the state of Iowa had established a sister state, sister province relationship with Hebei province. And Hebei province was sending an agricultural delegation to come and study corn processing. What could they observe and learn in Iowa about how to better process corn? Well, somehow a young county party secretary from Hebei got added to the delegation, probably because his father had been a big deal, big time advisor to Deng Xiaoping. And he shows up, and he's 31 years old, and his name is Xi Jinping. And he's treated, you know, Iowans are so nice. The American heartland is so nice. People are so friendly. He's taken around the state. He spends some time in a place called Muscatine and they're all taken in to live in people's homes. And this one family kind of threw their son out of his bedroom and let Xi Jinping stay in there. And it was very touching.
Mm-hmm.
So fast forward now to 2012. I'm in Des Moines, head of the World Food Prize.
Mm-hmm.
The governor of Iowa's name is Terry Branstad, who had been the governor in 1985 when Xi Jinping came. And Xi Jinping is vice president of China,
Mm-hmm.
about to become president. And he's on his last trip to the US as vice president. He's in Washington, I think going to New York, going to stop in LA. But he said, oh, he'd kind of like to go to Iowa. So the US and government and China had been planning to have a agricultural symposium. And they were actually going to hold it in Washington, D.C. But Secretary Tom Vilsack, the Secretary of Agriculture, calls me up and said, we're going to have this symposium and we're going to have it in Washington, but we'd like to have it in Iowa.
Mm-hmm.
But the only way we can do that is to have it take place in your World Food Prize Hall of Laureates building. So can we do that? I said, of course we can do that. So Xi Jinping flies to Iowa, goes to Muscatine in this people's home. He's standing, it's February, so it's cold, standing at the fireplace. Here are the families, some of the families who had welcomed him in 1985, 25 years ago. He's there talking to them about how they're old friends, and this is when he thinks of America, he thinks of them. He's sincerely touched by this. And Governor Branstad is with him. They fly back to Des Moines that night. The governor hosts a big dinner for him in the state capitol. Has my organization helps because we put on a dinner in the state capitol every year. We help with all of those arrangements. Xi Jinping gets up to give a toast, and he talks about his memory of seeing the sun over the Mississippi River and how powerful, and he quotes Mark Twain and stories from Mark Twain. So I'm sitting here in the middle of the country, in the middle of the heartland, and you can see that his experience in the heartland had genuinely touched his heart on this. So the next day, February 16th, you're going to come to my building, the World Food Prize Hall of Laureates, and Xi Jinping is going to give the opening keynote address at the US-China High-Level Agricultural Symposium. So I get to, as the host, providing the building, I have the honor to go out and meet the vice president and escort him into the building. So that's going to be my whole entire role. I'm sure somebody briefed him and said, here, this guy's going to meet you. It's his building. He's going to walk in with you. But because he had the Chinese foreign minister with him, the Chinese minister of agriculture with him. There was the U.S., the governor of Iowa, the U.S. Secretary of Agriculture, the U.S. ambassador to China, Gary Locke, who had been the governor of Washington, was with him. So all these big deal people. So car pulls up, I go out, I meet him, I shake hands. Mr. Vice President, welcome to the World Food Prize Hall of Laureates. And I start to escort him into the building. And it's all through an interpreter. And so I'm escorting him in, I'm just some guy, never gonna see again in the great scheme of anything, I don't matter. And so I say to him, oh, Mr. Vice President, you have such an interesting story. I'm going to commission a painting and hang it here in my building about your coming to Iowa, your connection to Iowa. It's such an interesting story. And so Vice President Xi kind of looks at me and says through the interpreter, "That's nice, thank you very much." Not giving too much, saying much. And then I say to him, "And by the way, Mr. Vice President, I just shook your hand. I'm one of the very, very few Iowans who shook your hand and also shook your father's hand when your father visited Iowa in 1980. And Vice President Xi Jinping literally stopped in his tracks. His eyes got big. He got a big smile on his face. He turned and looked at me because I had now said something he didn't expect and that was meaningful to him about his father. And he said, "Well, you have two interesting stories." So the painting, which hangs in that building, and a copy of it hangs in the office of now Ambassador Terry Branstad, the US ambassador to China. At the bottom in Chinese, it says, "Two interesting stories." And the painting captures that visit to Amana by his father, the transformation of China. And one of the elements in the painting is of Shanghai Harbor and the view now of Pudong. Because to me, it's where you see most dramatically, most vividly, the change between 1979 and 2016 of what represents what's happened all over China. So this connection, even though not very long, not an in-depth conversation, but it tracks this. And it tells the story of how the Xi family has this incredible legacy in the modernization of China. So in 2017, I was invited by the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences to come and speak at a think tank symposium in Beijing about the 19th Party Congress, at which President Xi Jinping, Party Secretary Xi Jinping, had given this 2 to 3 hour speech, painting this incredible vision for what China would be like in the future, and making reference to the great distance that China had come. And part of that was noting that now poverty in China was under 10%, maybe even under 5%, heading to zero. I think the goal is to have it be eliminated by 2021, the 100th anniversary of the establishment of the Chinese Communist Party. But so it's the Xi family has been part, an integral part of this transformation of China, and agricultural policy at the heart of all this. So back in 2012, February 16th, at the World Food Prize in Des Moines, Xi Jinping gives his keynote address, leaves to go out and visit a farm. After that, there's a signing ceremony for a strategic agreement in agricultural cooperation, signed by Secretary Vilsack, the Chinese Minister of Agriculture, Han Chang-fu. There is also a signing event, excuse me, a signing event by representatives of the Iowa soybean industry and the United Soybean Board, which represents all the Midwest, and Chinese companies to import $3.5 billion of American soybeans. So to me, it represented that day, that place, that event represented one of the true high points in the Chinese-American relationship. What had the apex of how much it had developed, how much I had witnessed, seeing a change from my first trip in '79, seeing what China was like then, seeing what China is like now. So I've continued to have other trips and involvement. At the time, one of the other most interesting was that in 2004, I took part in an event in Beijing put on by the Chinese Academy of Agricultural Sciences, put on a symposium with Norman Borlaug. His last trip to China, celebrated his 90th birthday. Chinese view him as a great and old friend. His Borlaug's pictures on the wall outside the president's office of the Chinese Academy of Agricultural Sciences. And then later that year, we gave our $250,000 prize, was shared, but to perhaps China's greatest agricultural scientist ever, named Yun Longping. Yun Longping is about 90 years old. He's still alive. He's called the father of hybrid rice. He did for China and rice what Norman Borlaug did for wheat in India and Pakistan. I have the great, I organized the event. Yun Longping came to Des Moines. Dr. Borlaug handed him our prize and the money. He was feted at our events. And we established an ongoing relationship with him. And he has, we call it the International Rice Forum. And he's the chairman, and I'm the vice chairman. So I go to Changsha, where his research center is located. In the winter, he goes to Sanya, where it's warmer, and where he actually did some of his original research. So I've been with him 2 or 3 times in China. I've been with him in Sanya. I've been with him in Changsha. We send one of our high school students there every year. And so I'm very, very pleased to have such a close personal friendship and relationship with Yun Longping. Now, one of the interesting things about Yun Longping, aside from his great scientific achievements in agriculture, for which he was honored at the recent national celebration in China. He was one of 2 people to receive China's highest medal, highest award it gives to civilians for great achievements. But Yun Longping, I discovered everyone in China knows his name. So I was having dinner in Shenzhen, which is now, it was a little fishing town in 1979. Now it's this incredible modern Silicon Valley of China type place. And I'm out having dinner with a Chinese colleague and friend, and we're out at a hot pot restaurant. And it's filled with kind of young Chinese professionals, people who work in offices, not high ranking or anything, pretty, standard, I said. And my friend says to me, he said, everybody in China knows who Yun Longping is. And I said, come on. He said, sure, just wait. When the servers come up, the waiters and wait, just ask them. So I can't speak Chinese. He has to be interpreter. So I said, you know who Yun Long Ping is? And he translates. And the server said, oh, yeah, he's the guy who did something with rice. Then the second one did that. And I thought, well, you know, maybe he's setting it up or he's told them to say yes. Or, so I get up and I'm walking around this restaurant. So I'm the only foreigner in the restaurant. Everybody's out. And I'm going table to table. And people are all, who are you? What's up? And I keep saying, you know who Yun Long Ping is? You know, and everybody knows. So now I'm beginning to believe. So then we're going on the train the next day from Shenzhen to Changsha to go and see Yun Long Ping. So there's, I asked a few people who are sitting nearby, yeah, we know Yun Long Ping. People don't always know what he did exactly, but they know he's the guy with rice produced. So there's a lady who's going down the aisle with a little cart selling coffee. Just there. So I said, I'm going to get him now. You know, she's not, there's no way somebody who's pushing the cart selling coffee on the train knows. So she stops and I order a coffee. And I said, by the way, do you know who Yun Long Ping is? Oh, yes, he's the man who developed rice and this. And so he is, of course, you can't say he's as well known as Xi Jinping. I'm sure he's not. But everybody in China seems to know who he is. He's the agricultural rock star of the country who's been at the forefront of this incredible transformation of Chinese agriculture, which has been an integral part of the overall economic development. So I've been, as I said, I send students back and forth to China every year, American high school students. I receive students from the Shijiazhuang Foreign Language School, 10 students every year. They come to Des Moines, they come to the World Food Prize Global Youth Institute. I've been to their school in Hebei province. Wow, what a terrific job they do teaching English. And then so many of the students go on to study at American universities. I'm sitting with these students who are like your age, they're in their early 20s or so, and they're studying at Columbia or at Cal Berkeley or Vanderbilt, wherever. I was asking, well, they're sort of testing, how much American culture do you get? And, so I'm asking them something about modern music, and they pull out their phone and start playing Taylor Swift or Shawn Mendes or whatever. It's so I'm so impressed about how the exchanges that we have and the relationships have the potential for doing something so dramatic, citizen diplomacy. So in a way, it's kind of heartbreaking to me to see that the government-to-government relationship has now come upon such hard times. My sense now, having been involved with in one way or another with China since 1979, my first visit there, is that to the extent that we can rebuild the relationship in any way, that we can pick up the pieces and put them back together again, can be done through agriculture and can be done through the heartland, through the American Middle West. I don't think it's going to get done so well between Washington and Beijing, or even New York and Shanghai, or Los Angeles and Guangzhou. It's going to come, I think, through agriculture. And one of the lessons I learned from when my first assignment to Vietnam as a diplomat in 1968 until today, 52, 53 years, is the powerful role agriculture can play in promoting peace. I have seen it time and time and time again. And there's actually a rich legacy of it in Iowa, not only around the connection with the Xi family in China. During the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union, at the most dangerous moment of human history, when the United States and the Soviet Union were poised to fire all of these strategic nuclear weapon missiles at each other, Soviet Premier Khrushchev came to the UN and was invited by a farmer in Iowa to come to Iowa. And the US government gave him permission. And Khrushchev in 1959, I was in high school, shows up in Iowa and goes out to the farm of a man named Roswell Garst. And they're out at the corn crib, and Khrushchev's holding up this big, beautiful ear of corn, saying, "Why can't I have corn like this in the Soviet Union?" And Garst, who's with him, sends his nephew, a man named John Crystal, back and forth to the Soviet Union over the next several decades. Mm-hmm. Now, they never discussed nuclear weapons. They never discussed treaties to reduce the threat of nuclear weapons. But what they did was they showed that there could be a way for our two countries, considered such adversaries, such enemies, threatened each other's existence, that there could be a way to work together on things. And agriculture was one of them. They built in this buffer zone. They eased the tensions enough so that those nuclear weapons were never fired. Mahatma Gandhi, 1929, forms the Congress Party to throw off colonial rule in India so that India could be a free and democratic country. Gandhi's a vegetarian, always worried about, will I be strong enough? Will I have sufficient nutrition? What can I do to fortify myself? And he hears that there's a scientist in America, doesn't even know his name, might be able to help him. And through friends, he reaches out to that man named George Washington Carver. And Carver was a professor at Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. But more significantly, he could never have been a professor or a scientist. He had been born in slavery in Missouri, where Governor Holden is from, and emancipated at the end of the Civil War, is able to go to school and wants to go to college. He applies, he's admitted, he shows up, and they see the color of his skin, and they turn him away. And he somehow ends up in Iowa. And he is encouraged there to go and apply at Iowa State University, 1889. Never had a student of color before. And they admit him. And he gets a bachelor's degree and a master's degree in horticulture, and would stay in Iowa forever, except Booker T. Washington said, "You have to come to the South. You have to come to Tuskegee. We're establishing this institute, this university to educate the freed Blacks in the South." And Carver goes there. And Gandhi reaches out to Carver. And they exchange letters. over the next 6 years, with Carver sending advice in his letters to my beloved friend, Mr. Gandhi. So when I tell the story, I say it's a matter of some pride for Iowa that a man who was a scientist only because of Iowa played a small, but maybe not totally insignificant role in over 1 billion people living in freedom and independence and sovereignty today. Peace through agriculture, Gandhi, Carver. I just made a proposal that Iowa should place the statue of George Washington Carver in the US Capitol. Every state gets 2 statues. I was just the chairman of the Norman Borlaug Statue Committee. We put his statue in the US Capitol on March 25th, 1914, the exact 100th centennial of his birth. And wouldn't it be marvelous to replace one of the Civil War heroes, the other statue of an Iowan, with, as he was known, in his slave name was George, was Carver's George. He was owned by the Carver family. He was a man named George, much like George Floyd, who had been killed. That was the inspiration for my proposal. So there are these incredible stories of peace through agriculture, of Norman Borlaug, of Yun Long Ping, of the heartland, again and again and again, how the heartland, agriculture are great asset, and our people, the people of the heartland, through their openness, their friendliness, can serve, can be that vehicle, that way. Whenever I speak now about COVID, I say China and the United States should be the collaborators in dealing with this terrible pandemic. And we should be coordinating our research and our effort to do this. I often would say that even before COVID about feeding the world. Whenever I speak, I say the single greatest challenge that the human species has ever confronted is, can we nutritiously and sustainably feed the 9 to 10 billion people who will be on our planet by the year 2049, which was the year Xi Jinping noted would be the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party attaining state power in their country. So he's laid out goals for China by the year 2049. So, but Norman Borlaug and the World Food Prize and myself said, this is the greatest challenge. And we are not on course to meet it now. It will take having peace in the world. It will take more research. It will take more innovators. It will take more ways of developing the global supply chain and the global trading system. And if Africa and South Asia and South America and Central America are to be fed nutritiously, if all human beings on our planet are going to be able to thrive and prosper, it will take this collaboration. So I would offer, and said, the World Food Prize in Des Moines is there, ready and available to host the next gathering of China and the US and others, as it may be, with the inspiration of Norman Borlaug, the inspiration of Yun Longping, the inspiration of the people of Iowa and the people of the heartland being so open, so welcoming, that we can do that here. This is the place to come. So that's those are the stories I tell. But when I go to China, Chinese individuals, leaders, scholars, officials are interested to meet me, because there aren't many people who have met Deng Xiaoping, Xi Jinping, Yun Longping, and Xi Jinping. So some young Chinese say, "Oh, can I shake your hand? Because I'm shaking your hand, and you shook the hand of those four great figures of Chinese history."
That's so amazing. I didn't realize, because I was under the impression that you shook Xi Jinping and his father's hand rather than like the four big figures. So that's amazing.
Yeah.
But yeah.
And the story. So the story, as last time I was in China in 2019, you know, the relationship was starting to be strained. Not as much as now, but starting to be strained. And I would tell people each time I'd be hosted for a lunch or a dinner, or I'd be meeting with, and I'd say, well, here's what I suggest, is whenever you're thinking about the negative feelings about the tariffs that have been established, trading problems, issues between our governments, you should think to July 22nd, 1944. Because on July 22nd, 1944, an American Air Force plane landed at Yan'an, which was where Mao Zedong and his army, after the Long March, had their base camp. So it's the middle of World War II. They're being bombed by Japanese planes. And we're in this great struggle at which the freedom, independence, and sovereignty of China and the United States was at risk of being lost. No matter what else, all the other things going on in the last 100 years, this was the moment when both of our countries could have had the largest, most significant tragedy of being conquered, of being defeated by a foreign adversary. And in the middle of that, we were allies, we were friends, because that plane on that day had US senior military officers and senior State Department officials, establishing for the first time ever a connection to the Chinese Communist Party. And so whatever hostility there is, remember that at the Chinese Communist Party's darkest hour, at China's darkest hour, and at America's darkest hour, we were friends, we were allies, and as a result, we remained free and independent and sovereign today.